Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22, 1941, was Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. This massive operation involved around 10 million soldiers and resulted in over 8 million casualties, making it the largest and most costly land offensive in history. Named after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, this operation aimed to destroy communism and conquer the Western Soviet Union. Nazi Germany's plan, known as Generalplan OST, sought to exploit the conquered territory's resources and use their people for forced labor. The ultimate goal was to create more living space for Germans by exterminating or deporting the native Slavic populations to Siberia, and implementing Germanization and enslavement policies. In the years before the invasion, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed several political and economic agreements. However, after the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, Germany started planning the invasion under the code name Operation Otto in July 1940. When the invasion commenced, over 3.8 million Axis troops, making up the largest invasion force ever, attacked the Western Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front, supported by 600,000 motor vehicles and as many horses. This marked a significant escalation in World War II and brought the USSR into the Allied coalition through the Anglo-Soviet Agreement. The Eastern Front, opened by Barbarossa, saw the most extensive and deadly battles in history. German forces captured approximately 5 million Soviet soldiers and killed millions through starvation and executions as part of their hunger plan. The Holocaust also saw over 1 million Soviet Jews murdered by German death squads and collaborators. Despite early German victories and occupation of key Soviet economic areas, Operation Barbarossa ultimately failed. The German offensive halted at the Battle of Moscow by the end of 1941, followed by a Soviet winter counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back 160 miles. The Red Army, unlike the Germans' expectations, did not collapse but instead managed to absorb the strongest German attacks, leading to a war of attrition that the Germans were unprepared for. The heavy losses and logistical strains weakened the Wehrmacht, preventing them from launching full-scale attacks along the Eastern Front. Subsequent operations, such as Case Blue in 1942 and Operation Citadel in 1943, failed, leading to further German defeats. These Soviet victories halted Germany's territorial expansion and foretold the eventual downfall of Nazi Germany in 1945. Background. The Nazi Party often used the theme of Barbarossa in their political imagery, continuing a tradition that German nationalists had embraced since the 19th century. According to a Germanic medieval legend, which was revived by 19th century German Romanticism, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who drowned in Asia Minor during the Third Crusade, is not dead but asleep in a cave in the Kyffhäuser Mountains in Thuringia. The legend says he will awaken in Germany's hour of greatest need to restore the nation to its former glory. Initially, the invasion of the Soviet Union was codenamed Operation Otto, referencing Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great's campaigns in Eastern Europe. However, in December 1940, Hitler changed the name to Operation Barbarossa. This change reflected his admiration for Barbarossa, whom he praised in July 1937 as the emperor who first spread Germanic cultural ideas through his imperial mission. For Hitler, the name Barbarossa symbolized the belief that conquering the Soviet Union would lead to the establishment of the Nazi Thousand-Year Reich. Racial policies of Nazi Germany. In his 1925 manifesto and autobiography, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler vaguely mentioned his plan to invade the Soviet Union, claiming that the German people needed Lebensraum, or living space, to ensure Germany's long-term survival. By February 1939, Hitler made it clear to his military commanders that the upcoming war would be a war of worldviews and a racial war. After World War II started, he emphasized that this racial war would decide who would rule Europe and the world. Nazi Germany's racial policy depicted the Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe as lands filled with non-Aryan subhumans controlled by Jewish Bolsheviks. Hitler's book Mein Kampf suggested that Germany's destiny was to turn to the east, similar to historical movements like the Aussiedlung 600 years earlier. The Nazis planned to kill, deport, or enslave most of the Russian and Slavic populations, and replace them with Germans as outlined in Generalplan. In the years before the invasion, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed several political and economic agreements. However, the occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina by the Soviets prompted the German High Command to plan an invasion. Initially called Operation Otto, Hitler renamed it Operation Barbarossa in December 1940. The military leaders of Nazi Germany were heavily influenced by the ideological nature of the conflict. German soldiers were indoctrinated with anti-Bolshevik, anti-Semitic, and anti-Slavic propaganda through various media. Hitler even compared the Soviets to the forces of Genghis Khan and portrayed them as a threat to Europe. After the invasion began, German troops targeted people described as Jewish Bolshevik subhumans, the Mongol hordes, and the Red Beast. The war was framed as an ideological battle between German National Socialism and Jewish Bolshevism, and a racial war against Jews, Romani, and Slavic people. Hitler ordered the SS Einsatzgruppen, who followed the Wehrmacht, to execute Soviet officials, gypsies, and Jews. 6 months into the invasion, these groups had killed over 500,000 Soviet Jews, more than the number of Red Army soldiers killed in combat at that time. German commanders blamed Jews for the partisan resistance, often saying, "Where there's a partisan, there's a Jew, and where there's a Jew, there's a partisan." This viewpoint led many German soldiers to view their Soviet enemies as subhuman. Following the start of the war, the Nazis banned sexual relations between Germans and foreign slaves, imposing the death penalty for violations. Heinrich Himmler, in his 1940 memorandum, outlined plans for the non-German populations in the East, believing that Germanization would be complete when only people with truly German blood remained in the region. The Generalplan OST, finalized in 1941 and 1942, called for ethnic cleansing, mass executions, and enslavement of the conquered populations. The plan had 2 phases, the Kleine Planung for wartime actions and the Grosse Planung for post-war policies, intended to be implemented over 25 to 30 years. General Erich Hübner's speech to the 4th Panzer Group encapsulated the Nazi racial policy. He described the war against the Soviet Union as essential for the German people's survival, framing it as a historical struggle against Slavs and emphasizing the need for unprecedented brutality. Hübner and other leaders like Walter von Brauchitsch reinforced the idea that this was a racial war requiring severe measures. Nazi imperialist ambitions rejected the humanity of both Jews and communists, viewing the struggle for Lebensraum as a war of annihilation. German-Soviet relations of 1939 to 1940. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty in Moscow. This pact included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Under this agreement, Germany and the Soviet Union would split Poland if Germany invaded, and the Soviets would be allowed to take control of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia. The world learned of this pact on August 23, 1939, but the secret provisions for partitioning Poland were not known. The agreement shocked the international community because of the previous hostility and ideological differences between the two countries. Following the pact, Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, sparking World War II in Europe. Soon after, the Soviet Union invaded and annexed eastern Poland. For 2 years, Germany and the Soviet Union maintained strong diplomatic and economic ties. They signed a trade pact in 1940, which allowed the Soviets to receive German military equipment and goods in exchange for raw materials like oil and wheat, helping Germany bypass the British blockade. Despite the seemingly cordial relations, both sides were deeply suspicious of each other. For example, the Soviet invasion of Bukovina in June 1940 exceeded the agreed-upon sphere of influence. Germany, having joined the Axis Pact with Japan and Italy, began negotiations about a potential Soviet entry into the pact. After negotiations in Berlin in November 1940, Germany proposed that the Soviet Union join the Axis. The Soviets countered with their own proposal, but Germany did not respond. As tensions rose in Eastern Europe, the likelihood of conflict increased. In January 1941, they signed a border and commercial agreement to address some issues, but the relationship remained strained. Historian Robert Service notes that Stalin believed in the Soviet Union's military strength and thought Germany would not risk a two-front war while still fighting Britain. Consequently, Stalin delayed fortifying the border regions. When German soldiers swam across the Bug River to warn the Soviets of an impending attack, they were treated as enemy agents and shot. Some historians argue that Stalin never intended to remain allied with Germany and might have planned his own campaign against Germany and eventually all of Europe. Others believe that Stalin did not have such plans in June 1941, given the poor state of the Red Army at the time. Axis invasion plans. Stalin's reputation as a brutal dictator gave the Nazis justification for their assault on the Soviet Union and raised their expectations of success. Stalin's Great Purge in the 1930s had executed many competent and experienced military officers, weakening Red Army leadership. Nazi propaganda often highlighted the Soviet regime's brutality, portraying their invasion as a preemptive strike against an allegedly planned Soviet attack on Germany. Hitler also used rising tensions over territories in the Balkans as a pretext for the invasion. In June 1940, he told a general that victories in Western Europe had finally freed his hands for a final showdown with Bolshevism. Following the successful campaign in France, General Erich Marx was tasked with drafting the initial invasion plans for the Soviet Union, known as the Marx Plan. This plan proposed an assault stretching from Arkhangelsk in the north to Astrakhan in the south, aiming to establish a military border to protect Germany from enemy bombers. Despite warnings from high-ranking officers like Friedrich Paulus about the economic burden of occupying Western Russia, Hitler expected benefits such as reducing labor shortages in Germany by demobilizing divisions, exploiting Ukraine's agricultural resources, and using forced labor to boost the German economy. He also believed Britain would seek peace once Germany triumphed in the Soviet Union, and if not, he would use the resources gained in the East to defeat the British Empire. Hitler received the final military plans for the invasion, codenamed Operation Otto, on December 5, 1940. He formally committed to the invasion with Führer Directive 21 on December 18, 1940, outlining the operation's execution. Hitler renamed the operation to Barbarossa, honoring Emperor Friedrich I of the Holy Roman Empire. The Barbarossa Decree on March 30, 1941, declared the war against the Soviet Union as one of annihilation, sanctioning the eradication of all communist leaders and intellectuals in Eastern Europe. The invasion was set for May 1941 but was delayed for further preparations and better weather. German historian Andreas Hillgruber noted that the invasion plans were influenced by overconfidence following the rapid defeat of France and stereotypical views of Russia as a backward country. Despite some military officials warning of the economic and political risks of invading the Soviet Union, Hitler, focused on his ideological goal of eliminating communism, disregarded these concerns. Hitler believed the key to victory lay in destroying the Red Army rather than capturing specific territories. He often emphasized the need to prioritize Leningrad, the Donbas, and then Moscow. This approach led to disagreements with several senior officers who believed that capturing Moscow was crucial for a decisive victory. Hitler's overconfidence, bolstered by earlier successes in Western Europe, made him dismissive of their advice. German preparations. Even before the campaign in the Balkans was completed, the Germans had begun massing troops near the Soviet border. By the third week of February 1941, 680,000 German soldiers were assembled along the Romanian-Soviet border. In preparation for the attack, Hitler secretly moved over 3 million German troops and approximately 690,000 Axis soldiers to the Soviet border regions. The Luftwaffe also conducted numerous aerial surveillance missions over Soviet territory months before the attack. Despite the alarming buildup, Stalin believed that Germany was unlikely to attack just 2 years after signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, leading to slow Soviet preparations. However, the Soviets did not entirely ignore the threat. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko referred to the Germans as the Soviet Union's most important and strongest enemy, and in July 1940, the Red Army Chief of Staff, Boris Shaposnikov, developed a preliminary three-pronged plan for a German invasion that closely resembled the actual attack. Since April 1941, the Germans had been setting up simulated operations, Operation Haifisch and Operation Harpuna, to convince the Soviets that Britain was their real target. The invasion, initially planned for May 15, 1941, was postponed to June 22, 1941. This delay is attributed to the unforeseen need to invade Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. Historian Thomas B. Buell noted that Finland and Romania needed more time to prepare for their roles in the invasion. Additionally, an unusually wet winter kept rivers at full flood until late spring, possibly discouraging an earlier attack. The significance of this delay is debated. Some historians, like William Shirer, argue that the Balkan campaign's delay jeopardized Barbarossa, while others believe the June 22 start date was still sufficient for the offensive to reach Moscow by September. For Operation Barbarossa, the Germans deployed 1 independent regiment, 1 motorized training brigade, and 153 divisions, including 104 infantry, 19 panzer, and 15 motorized infantry divisions, organized into 3 army groups. They had 6,867 armored vehicles, 2,770 to 4,389 aircraft, 7,200 to 23,435 artillery pieces, 17,081 mortars, about 600,000 motor vehicles, and 625,000 to 700,000 horses. Finland contributed 14 divisions, and Romania offered 13 divisions and 8 brigades. In total, 3.8 million Axis personnel were deployed across a front stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, organized into Army Norway, Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South, supported by 3 Luftflotten, air fleets. Army Norway operated in far northern Scandinavia and bordering Soviet territories. Army Group North aimed to march through Latvia and Estonia into northern Russia, then take or destroy Leningrad and link up with Finnish forces. Army Group Center, the most heavily armed, planned to strike from Poland into Belorussia and central Russia, advancing to Smolensk and then Moscow. Army Group South targeted Ukraine's populous and fertile heartland, intending to capture Kiev and continue eastward to the Volga, aiming for the oil-rich Caucasus. Army Group South was divided into two sections, with the northern section in southern Poland and the southern section in Romania. In the rear, German forces, mainly Waffen-SS and Einsatzgruppen units, were tasked with countering partisan activity and executing captured Soviet political commissars and Jews. On June 17, Reich Security Main Office Chief Reinhard Heydrich briefed Einsatzgruppen commanders on the policy of eliminating Jews in Soviet territories. While assigned to Wehrmacht units for logistical support, the Einsatzgruppen were controlled by the RSHA. The official plan for Barbarossa assumed that the army groups could advance to their primary objectives simultaneously once they won the border battles and destroy the Red Army's forces in the border area. Soviet preparations. In 1930, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a leading Soviet military theorist, pushed for a significant increase in weapon production, advocating for 40,000 aircraft and 50,000 tanks. The early 1930s saw the development of a modern operational doctrine for the Red Army, encapsulated in the 1936 field regulations through the deep battle concept. Consequently, defense spending surged from 12% of the gross national product in 1933 to 18% by 1940. During Stalin's Great Purge in the late 1930s, many competent military officers were executed or imprisoned, weakening the Red Army's leadership. Of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union appointed in 1935, only Kliment Voroshilov and Semyon Budyonny survived. The purge led to the execution of 15 out of 16 army commanders and a significant portion of the officer corps. By 1941, about 30,000 Red Army personnel had been executed. To ensure loyalty, Stalin reintroduced political commissars to oversee the army. Despite these efforts, the Red Army's poor performance in Poland and the Winter War prompted the reinstatement of 80% of officers dismissed during the purge by 1941. This period also saw the activation of 161 new divisions. Anticipating the German threat, in July 1940, the Red Army General Staff identified the Wehrmacht as the primary threat, predicting a German attack through Belorussia north of the Pripyat marshes. Stalin, however, believed the main attack would focus on Ukraine. This assumption shaped Soviet war plans and troop deployments. Despite warnings from British and Soviet intelligence about a potential German attack, Stalin remained skeptical, thinking they were attempts to drag the Soviet Union into the war prematurely. Even with warnings from various sources, including Chinese intelligence and Soviet spy Richard Sorge, Stalin was cautious not to provoke Hitler while making some preparations for an attack. Soviet military readiness and mobilization. By early 1941, Stalin authorized the State Defense Plan 1941, DP-41, and the Mobilization Plan 1941, MP-41, which called for the deployment of 186 divisions in the Western Soviet Union, forming the first strategic echelon, and another 51 divisions as the second strategic echelon along the Dvina and Dnieper rivers. However, by June 22, 1941, the first echelon had 171 divisions, with the second echelon still mobilizing. When the invasion began, the Soviet military had mobilized between 5.3 and 5.5 million personnel, with ongoing mobilization of a 14 million strong reserve force. The Red Army possessed 33,000 pieces of artillery and around 23,000 tanks, with 14,700 combat ready. Despite their numerical superiority in tanks, many were poorly maintained and lacked adequate support and supplies. Advanced tank models like the KV-1 and T-34 were few in number and not widely available at the invasion's onset. Soviet tank units often lacked coordination and logistical support, leading to quick depletion in battles. The Soviet Air Force, VVS, was the largest in the world in 1941, with approximately 19,533 aircraft, but operational readiness was an issue. Debate on Soviet intentions. There is ongoing debate among historians about whether Stalin planned an invasion of German territory in the summer of 1941. Viktor Suvorov's controversial thesis in Icebreaker suggested that Stalin saw the war in Western Europe as an opportunity to spread communism and was preparing for an imminent attack on Germany. While some historians and former German generals supported this view, it is largely rejected by the majority of historians who believe Stalin aimed to avoid war in 1941, considering the Red Army's unpreparedness. This debate has generated extensive scholarly literature, enriching the understanding of Soviet and global history during the interwar period. The invasion begins. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the Soviet military districts and the border areas received a critical alert from NKO Directive No. 1, issued late the previous night. The directive instructed them to prepare for combat readiness while avoiding any provocative actions. However, the order took up to 2 hours to reach many units, and most did not receive it before the German invasion commenced. On the night of June 21, a German communist deserter, Alfred Liskow, crossed the lines and warned the Soviets of an imminent attack scheduled for 4 o'clock. Despite informing Stalin, he dismissed it as disinformation, and Liskow was still being interrogated when the invasion began. On June 21, at 1300 hours, Army Group North received the code word Dusseldorf, indicating that Operation Barbarossa would start the next morning. They relayed their own code word, Dortmund, down the chain of command. At around 3:15 on June 22, 1941, the Axis powers launched their invasion with bombing raids on major cities in Soviet-occupied Poland and an extensive artillery barrage on Red Army defenses along the entire front. Air raids extended as far as Kronstadt near Leningrad, Ismail in Bessarabia, and Sevastopol in Crimea. Simultaneously, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop presented the Soviet Union with a declaration of war, while ground troops, supported by Lithuanian and Ukrainian partisans in some areas, crossed the border. Approximately 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers, alongside Finnish and Romanian units, advanced and encountered slightly fewer Soviet troops at the border. At noon, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov broadcast the news of the invasion to the Soviet populace. Without a declaration of war, German forces fell on our country, attacked our frontiers in many places. The Red Army and the whole nation will wage a victorious patriotic war for our beloved country, for honor, for liberty. Our cause is just. The enemy will be beaten. Victory will be ours. By appealing to national patriotism rather than party loyalty, Molotov resonated with a shocked populace, helping them process the grim news. Within days, the Soviet High Command and Red Army underwent extensive reorganization to gear up for the war effort. Stalin addressed the nation on July 3, rallying them for a patriotic war of the entire Soviet people. In Germany, on the morning of June 22, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels announced the invasion to the nation in a radio broadcast featuring Hitler's words, "At this moment a march is taking place that, for its extent, compares with the greatest the world has ever seen. I have decided today to place the fate and future of the Reich and our people in the hands of our soldiers. May God aid us, especially in this fight." Later that morning, Hitler confidently predicted to his colleagues that within 3 months, Russia would experience an unprecedented collapse. He also addressed the German people via radio, portraying himself as a man of peace who had reluctantly decided to attack the Soviet Union. Following the invasion, Goebbels promoted the slogan European Crusade against Bolshevism, leading to thousands of volunteers and conscripts joining the Waffen-SS. Initial attacks, the German ground and air assault that began on June 22, 1941, delivered a devastating blow to Soviet forces, annihilating their organizational command and control within hours. This paralysis extended from the lowest infantry units to the Soviet High Command in Moscow. Initially, Moscow struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster facing their border forces, and Stalin's first reaction was one of disbelief. At around 7:15, Stalin issued NKO Directive No. 2, which informed the Soviet armed forces of the invasion and ordered them to counterattack the Axis forces wherever they had breached the borders, including launching airstrikes into German border regions. This was quickly followed by NKO Directive No. 3 at 9:15, signed by Timoshenko, which called for a sweeping counteroffensive across the entire front, with the hope of driving the enemy out of Soviet territory. This order, however, was not grounded in the reality of the military situation. Commanders, fearing retribution if they disobeyed, relayed the orders despite knowing the grim circumstances. It took several days for the Soviet leadership to fully grasp the extent of the initial defeat. Air war. The Luftwaffe began Operation Barbarossa with a devastating series of attacks aimed at crippling Soviet air power and command structures. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units meticulously identified Soviet troop concentrations, supply depots, and airfields, marking them for destruction. The goal was to disrupt Soviet mobilization and organization before they could mount an effective response. In stark contrast, Soviet artillery observers stationed along the border were under strict orders not to fire on German aircraft before the invasion. This restraint stemmed from Stalin's initial belief that the German assault might not have been authorized by Hitler himself. This hesitation led to significant Soviet territorial losses and the destruction of many Red Army units in the early days of the invasion. On the first day of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe reportedly destroyed 1,489 Soviet aircraft, with the number rising to over 3,100 within the first 3 days. Hermann Göring, skeptical of these reports, ordered an investigation. Surveys of wreckage on Soviet airfields confirmed that initial figures were conservative, estimating that over 2,000 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed on the first day alone. Soviet archival documents later indicated even higher losses, recording 3,922 aircraft lost in the first 3 days compared to an estimated 78 German aircraft. By the end of the first week, the Luftwaffe had achieved air supremacy over the battlefields, although it struggled to maintain this dominance over the vast territories of the Western Soviet Union. The German High Command's war diaries reveal that by July 5, the Luftwaffe had lost 491 aircraft and had 316 more damaged, reducing its operational strength to about 70% of what it had been at the start of the invasion. Baltic countries. On 22nd of June, Army Group North launched its offensive against the Soviet Northwestern Front, successfully breaking through the 8th and 11th Armies. The Soviets responded with a strong counterattack using the 3rd and 12th Mechanized Corps against the German 4th Panzer Group, but this assault was decisively repelled. By 25th of June, the 8th and 11th Armies received orders to retreat to the western Dvina River, planning to regroup with the 21st Mechanized Corps and the 22nd and 27th Armies. However, the swift advance of Erich von Manstein's LVI Panzer Corps outpaced them, reaching and securing a bridgehead across the river on 26th of June. This forced the Northwestern Front to abandon its defensive positions along the river. In response, on 29th of June, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, ordered a further withdrawal to the Stalin Line, a series of fortifications defending the approaches to Leningrad. On 2nd of July, Army Group North commenced its assault on the Stalin Line with the 4th Panzer Group. By 8th of July, they had captured Pskov, effectively dismantling the Stalin Line's defenses and pushing into Leningrad Oblast. The 4th Panzer Group had advanced approximately 280 miles since the invasion began, and by 9th of July, it was just 160 miles from Leningrad. The next phase of their operation targeted the Soviet defenses along the Luga River in the Leningrad Oblast, drawing closer to their primary objective, Leningrad. Ukraine and Moldavia, Army Group South, divided into northern and southern sections, faced significant challenges from both the terrain and the Soviet forces. The northern section confronted the Southwestern Front, which housed the largest concentration of Soviet troops, while the southern section faced the Southern Front. The Pripyat marshes and the Carpathian Mountains further complicated their advance. On 22nd of June, only the northern section of Army Group South commenced its attack. The difficult terrain slowed their progress, allowing Soviet defenders time to organize. Despite this, the German 1st Panzer Group and 6th Army managed to break through the Soviet 5th Army's defenses. Soviet counterattacks. Starting on the night of 23rd of June, the Soviet 22nd and 15th Mechanized Corps launched attacks on the flanks of the 1st Panzer Group from both the north and south. However, due to poor coordination, these attacks were not synchronized. The 22nd Mechanized Corps encountered the 1st Panzer Army's 3 motorized corps and suffered severe losses, including the death of its commander. Meanwhile, the 1st Panzer Group largely bypassed the 15th Mechanized Corps, which was subsequently engaged and defeated by the German 6th Army's 297th Infantry Division with the help of Luftwaffe support. On 26th of June, the Soviets launched a larger counterattack with the 9th, 19th, and 8th Mechanized Corps, supported by the remnants of the 15th Mechanized Corps. This force, fielding a total of 1,649 tanks, attacked the 1st Panzer Group from both the north and south. Despite the scale of this assault, the battle, which lasted 4 days, ended in a decisive defeat for the Soviet tank units. By 30th of June, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, ordered the remaining forces of the Southwestern Front to withdraw to the Stalin Line to defend the approaches to Kiev. Invasion of Moldavia. On 2nd of July, the southern section of Army Group South, comprising the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies and the German 11th Army, launched an invasion of Soviet Moldavia. The Southern Front, tasked with defending Moldavia, attempted counterattacks with its 2nd Mechanized Corps and 9th Army but were defeated. By 9th of July, the Axis advance had stalled along the defensive lines held by the Soviet 18th Army between the Prut and Dniester rivers. The initial stages of the invasion of Ukraine and Moldavia highlighted both the fierce resistance of Soviet forces and the formidable coordination and firepower of the German and Axis troops. Despite initial setbacks and counterattacks, the Axis forces were able to press forward, gradually overcoming the obstacles presented by both the Soviet defenses and the challenging terrain. Belorussia. In the early hours of the invasion on June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe launched devastating attacks that crippled the Western Front's air force, destroying many aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe, with assistance from the Abwehr and anti-communist Fifth Columns, also disrupted Soviet communication lines, effectively isolating the Soviet Fourth Army headquarters from its higher and lower command echelons. On the same day, the 2nd Panzer Group crossed the Bug River, broke through the Fourth Army, bypassed Brest Fortress, and advanced towards Minsk. Simultaneously, the 3rd Panzer Group bypassed most of the Soviet 3rd Army and headed towards Vilnius. The German 4th and 9th Armies engaged Western Front forces around Białystok. Soviet counterattack. In response to the German advance, Western Front commander Dmitry Pavlov ordered a counterstrike. On 24 to 25 June, the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps and the 6th Cavalry Corps launched a strong counterattack towards Grodno, aiming to destroy the 3rd Panzer Group. However, by the time the Soviet forces launched their attack, the 3rd Panzer Group had already moved on, reaching Vilnius on the evening of 23 June. The Soviet counterattack ran into well-prepared German infantry and anti-tank defenses supported by Luftwaffe air strikes. By the night of 25 June, the Soviet counterattack was decisively defeated, and the commander of the 6th Cavalry Corps was captured. Pavlov then ordered the remnants of the Western Front to withdraw towards Minsk. Encirclement and aftermath. Despite desperate counterattacks to buy time for the withdrawal, the Soviet forces could not halt the German advance. On 27 June, the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups linked up near Minsk, capturing the city the following day and encircling nearly all of the Western Front in 2 pockets, one around Białystok and another west of Minsk. The German forces destroyed the Soviet 3rd and 10th Armies, inflicted severe losses on the 4th, 11th, and 13th Armies, and captured 324,000 Soviet troops, 3,300 tanks, and 1,800 artillery pieces. Response to panic and discipline measures. On 29 June, a Soviet directive was issued to combat widespread panic among both civilians and military personnel. The directive mandated swift and severe measures against anyone inciting panic or displaying cowardice. The NKVD, working with commissars and military commanders, established field expedient general courts to deal with civilians spreading rumors and military deserters. Soldiers retreating without authorization were rounded up and dealt with harshly. Command changes and continued German advance. On 30 June, Stalin relieved Pavlov of his command. On 22 July, Pavlov and several members of his staff were tried and executed on charges of cowardice and criminal incompetence. Despite Hitler's instructions, conveyed through Brauchitsch, to halt the advance of the panzers until infantry formations caught up, some commanders continued their push eastward. General Heinz Guderian, with the tacit support of Bach and Halder, pressed on towards Bobruisk, reporting the advance as a reconnaissance in force. Guderian conducted an aerial inspection of the Minsk-Białystok pocket on 30 June and concluded that his panzer group was not needed to contain it, as the 3rd Panzer Group was already engaged there. On 1 July, Bach ordered the panzer groups to resume their full offensive eastward on the morning of 3 July, despite opposition from Brauchitsch and Halder. The panzer groups resumed their advance on 2 July, ahead of the infantry formations. The rapid and overwhelming success of the initial German offensive in Belorussia showcased the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg strategy, as well as the severe deficiencies in the Soviet command structure and preparedness. The encirclement and destruction of significant Soviet forces in the Białystok-Minsk pocket set the stage for further German advances into the Soviet Union. Northeast Finland. During the German-Finnish negotiations leading up to Operation Barbarossa, Finland insisted on maintaining neutrality unless directly attacked by the Soviet Union. In an effort to bring Finland into the conflict, Germany aimed to provoke a Soviet attack. Following the launch of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, German aircraft used Finnish air bases to strike Soviet positions. Concurrently, Germany initiated Operation Rentier, quickly occupying the Petsamo province along the Finnish-Soviet border. Finland also began to remilitarize the neutral Åland Islands. Despite these actions, the Finnish government maintained a stance of neutrality through diplomatic channels. However, the Soviet Union already considered Finland an ally of Germany. Soviet bombing and Finnish declaration of war. On June 25, 1941, the Soviet Union launched extensive bombing raids against major Finnish cities and industrial centers, including Helsinki, Turku, and Lahti. In response to this aggression, the Finnish parliament held an emergency night session and decided to declare war on the Soviet Union the same day. Finnish operational zones. Finland was divided into 2 key operational zones for the conflict. Northern Finland served as the staging area for Army Norway, tasked with executing Operation Silver Fox, a 2-pronged pincer movement aimed at capturing the strategic port of Murmansk. Southern Finland remained under the command of the Finnish Army, which initially focused on reclaiming Finnish Karelia at Lake Ladoga and the Karelian Isthmus, including the city of Viipuri, Finland's second-largest city. Initial engagements. In northern Finland, the German and Finnish forces commenced their joint offensive operations with the objective of severing Soviet supply lines and capturing Murmansk. The harsh terrain and extreme weather conditions posed significant challenges, but the operation aimed to disrupt the vital Murmansk Railway, a crucial supply route for the Soviet Union. In southern Finland, Finnish forces advanced into Karelia, aiming to retake territory lost during the Winter War. The offensive was characterized by swift movements and strategic encirclements, leveraging the experience gained from previous conflicts with the Soviet Union. Strategic implications: the Finnish involvement in Operation Barbarossa significantly impacted the broader Eastern Front. By engaging Soviet forces in the north, Finnish and German troops diverted Soviet resources and attention away from the central and southern theaters of the war. This cooperation underscored the strategic importance of Finland's geographical position and its military capabilities in the context of the larger German-Soviet conflict. The Finnish declaration of war and subsequent military operations highlighted the complex interplay of diplomacy, military strategy, and regional alliances that shaped the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. Finland's actions, initially driven by a desire to regain lost territory and protect its sovereignty, ultimately contributed to the wider goals of the Axis powers in their campaign against the Soviet Union. Further German advances. Smolensk and the shift in strategy. On July 2, 1941, a heavy rainstorm typical of Belarusian summer slowed the advance of Army Group Center's panzers. This delay allowed the Soviets to reinforce their defenses and plan a counterattack. Army Group Center aimed to capture Smolensk, a critical city on the road to Moscow. 6 Soviet armies fortified an old defensive line in the region, preparing to resist the German onslaught. On 6 July, the Soviets launched a significant counterattack involving the 5 and 7 Mechanized Corps of the 20th Army. These forces clashed with the German 39th and 47th Panzer Corps, resulting in a fierce 5-day battle where the Red Army lost 832 of the 2,000 tanks deployed. The Germans, aided by the Luftwaffe's tank-busting aircraft, managed to repel the Soviet assault. Encircling Smolensk, despite the counterattack, the 2nd Panzer Group crossed the Dnieper River, approaching Smolensk from the south, while the 3rd Panzer Group advanced from the north after defeating Soviet forces. By 16 July, the 29th Motorized Division had captured Smolensk, but a gap remained between the German forces. It wasn't until 5 August that the encirclement was complete, trapping 3 Soviet armies. The Germans claimed to have captured around 300,000 Soviet soldiers and destroyed 3,205 tanks, though many Red Army soldiers managed to escape to continue resisting the German advance. Logistical challenges and strategic reassessment. 4 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, the Germans realized they had underestimated Soviet strength and resilience. General Bock noted that German difficulties were compounded by logistical issues, including the depletion of initial supplies and the need for reinforcements and provisions. The poor condition of roads further hindered the movement of wheeled vehicles and infantry, making it difficult for them to keep pace with the faster armored units. By 2 August, the German forces had suffered 179,500 casualties but had received only 47,000 replacements. Hitler's strategic shift. As the campaign progressed, Hitler lost faith in the strategy of encirclement, noting that many Soviet soldiers had managed to evade capture. He shifted his focus to depriving the Soviet Union of its industrial capacity, targeting the industrial centers of Kharkov, the Donbas, and the oil fields of the Caucasus in the south, and the military production hub of Leningrad in the north. Debate among German commanders. Most German generals, including Halder and Bock, favored a continued drive toward Moscow, arguing for its strategic importance as a major arms production center, communication hub, and transport nexus. Intelligence suggested that the bulk of the Red Army was positioned near Moscow for its defense. Bock and Halder sent Guderian to present their case to Hitler. However, Hitler decided to redirect Army Group Center's tanks to support operations in the north and south, temporarily halting the push toward Moscow. Guderian, convinced by Hitler's rationale, returned to his commanders with new orders, causing friction among the German high command. The impact of the strategic shift. Hitler's decision marked a significant strategic shift in the German invasion of the Soviet Union. While the German forces had made substantial gains, capturing key cities and encircling Soviet armies, the delay and diversion of resources began to strain their operational effectiveness. The Red Army, despite suffering severe losses, continued to regroup and strengthen its defenses, setting the stage for prolonged and grueling battles on the Eastern Front. The Murmansk Offensive. On June 29, 1941, Germany launched a pincer attack to capture the strategic port city of Murmansk. The northern pincer, executed by Mountain Corps Norway, crossed the border at Petsamo, aiming to approach Murmansk directly. However, the advance was halted in mid-July by the Soviet 14th Army, which put up heavy resistance at the Litsa River after securing the Rybaki Peninsula. Despite renewed attacks, The German forces could not break through, and the front turned into a stalemate for the rest of Operation Barbarossa. The Sala offensive, the second part of the pincer attack, began on 1 July, involving the German 36 Corps and Finnish 3 Corps. Their initial objective was to recapture the Sala region for Finland and then move eastward to cut the Murmansk railway near Kandalaksha. The German troops struggled with the harsh Arctic conditions. After intense fighting, Sala was captured on 8 July. To maintain momentum, the German-Finnish forces pressed eastward but encountered stiff Soviet resistance at the town of Kairali, halting their advance. Finnish 3 Corps advance. Further south, the Finnish 3 Corps independently pushed through the Arctic terrain to reach the Murmansk railway. They faced only one division of the Soviet 7th Army, allowing for rapid progress. By 7 August, the Finnish forces captured Kestanga and approached the outskirts of Ukta. However, significant Red Army reinforcements arrived, preventing further gains on both fronts. Consequently, the German-Finnish forces were forced to adopt a defensive stance. Finnish reconquest of Ladoga Karelia. In the southern region of Karelia, Finland aimed for a swift advance to Lake Ladoga to split Soviet forces and reclaim their territories east of the lake. The attack began on July 10, 1941. The Finnish Army of Karelia, holding a numerical advantage over the Soviet 7th and 23rd Armies, advanced rapidly. On 14 July, they captured the strategic road junction at Loimola. By 16 July, Finnish troops reached Lake Ladoga at Korinoja, successfully cutting Soviet forces in half. Throughout July, the Finnish army continued pushing southeast into Karelia, halting at the former Finnish-Soviet border at Mansala. Finnish reconquest of the Karelian Isthmus. With Soviet forces divided, the Finnish army shifted focus to the Karelian Isthmus, aiming to reclaim Viipuri, Viborg. They attempted to encircle Soviet formations at Sortavala and Hiitola by advancing towards the western shores of Lake Ladoga. By mid-August, they succeeded in encircling and capturing both towns, although many Soviet units managed to evacuate by sea. The Finnish army then launched an assault on Viipuri. As Soviet resistance crumbled, Finnish forces encircled the city by advancing to the Vuoksi River, capturing Viipuri on 29 August. This marked the start of a broader Finnish advance across the Karelian Isthmus. By early September, Finland had restored its pre-Winter War borders, achieving a significant strategic and symbolic victory. Offensive towards central Russia. By mid-July 1941, German forces were closing in on Kiev, advancing from the area below the Pripyat marshes. The 1st Panzer Group moved south, while the 17th Army advanced eastward, successfully encircling 3 Soviet armies near Uman. After eliminating this pocket, German tanks turned north and crossed the Dnieper River. Simultaneously, the 2nd Panzer Group, diverted from Army Group Center, crossed the Desna River, with the 2nd Army supporting its right flank. This maneuver trapped 4 more Soviet armies and parts of 2 others. By August, the Luftwaffe, strained by continuous combat, saw its operational capability and aircraft numbers dwindle. Despite this, the need for air support increased as the Soviet Air Force, VVS, began to recover. The Luftwaffe struggled to maintain air superiority as bad weather set in by October, frequently grounding operations. In contrast, the VVS benefited from its pre-war cold weather flying experience and intact air bases, gradually gaining the upper hand. By December, the VVS matched the Luftwaffe in strength and was pushing to dominate the skies over the battlefields. Siege of Leningrad. For the final assault on Leningrad, the 4th Panzer Group received reinforcements from Army Group Center. On August 8, 1941, the panzers broke through Soviet defenses, and by the end of the month, they were within 30 miles of Leningrad. Meanwhile, Finnish forces advanced southeast on both sides of Lake Ladoga, reaching the old Finnish-Soviet border. During August, the Germans launched a fierce attack on Leningrad. In the subsequent Black Months, 400,000 residents worked tirelessly to build fortifications, and 160,000 more joined the Red Army. The spirit of mass mobilization was particularly strong in Leningrad, where reserve troops and newly formed Narodno-Opalkany units, consisting of worker battalions and even schoolboys, dug trenches and prepared to defend the city. On 7 September, the German 20th Motorized Division captured Schleswig-Holstein, cutting off all land routes to Leningrad. They severed the railroads to Moscow and, with Finnish help, captured the railroad to Murmansk, starting a siege that would last over 2 years. Hitler then ordered the total destruction of Leningrad without taking any prisoners. On 9 September, Army Group North began its final push. Within 10 days, they were only about 7 miles from the city. However, progress slowed significantly, and casualties increased. Frustrated, Hitler ordered that Leningrad be starved into submission rather than stormed. Following this directive, The OKH issued orders on September 22, 1941 to carry out Hitler's plan. Meanwhile, Army Group Center, deprived of its panzer forces, became static and faced several Soviet counterattacks. One notable attack, the Yelnya Offensive, resulted in the Germans' first major tactical defeat since the invasion began, boosting Soviet morale. These Soviet offensives forced Hitler to refocus on Army Group Center's drive towards Moscow. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies were ordered to abandon the siege of Leningrad and support the attack on Moscow. Battle of Kiev, 1941. Before launching the attack on Moscow, the Germans needed to complete their operations in Kiev. Half of Army Group Center moved south to encircle Soviet forces from behind, while Army Group South advanced north from its Dnieper bridgehead. The encirclement was completed on September 16, 1941. A fierce battle followed, with the Soviets facing relentless tank, artillery, and aerial bombardment. After 10 days of intense fighting, the Germans claimed to have captured 665,000 Soviet soldiers, although the actual number was likely around 220,000. Soviet losses included 452,720 men and 3,867 artillery pieces and mortars from 43 divisions of the 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th Soviet armies. Despite the heavy exhaustion and significant losses experienced by some German units, up to 75% of their men, the overwhelming defeat of the Soviets at Kiev and the Red Army's substantial losses during the first 3 months of the campaign contributed to the German belief that Operation Typhoon, the planned assault on Moscow, could still succeed. Sea of Azov. After successfully concluding operations at Kiev, Army Group South moved east and south to capture the industrial Donbas region and the strategic Crimea. On 26 September, the Soviet Southern Front launched an attack with 2 armies along the northern shores of the Sea of Azov against elements of the German 11th Army, which was also advancing into the Crimea. On 1 October, the 1st Panzer Army under Ewald von Kleist launched a counteroffensive, sweeping south to encircle the 2 attacking Soviet armies. By 7 October, the Soviet 9th and 18th Armies were isolated, and 4 days later, they were annihilated. The Soviet defeat was catastrophic, with 106,332 men captured, 212 tanks destroyed or captured, and 766 artillery pieces lost in the pocket alone. The loss of 2/3 of the Southern Front's troops in just 4 days left its left flank exposed. This allowed the Germans to capture Kharkiv on 24 October. Kleist's 1st Panzer Army also took control of the Donbas region within the same month. Central and Northern Finland Front in December 1941. In central Finland, the German-Finnish offensive on the Murmansk Railway resumed at Kairali. A large encirclement from the north and south trapped the defending Soviet Corps, allowing 36 Corps to advance further east. By early September, they had reached the old 1939 Soviet border fortifications. On 6 September, the first defense line at the Voida River was breached, but further attacks against the main line at the Verman River failed. As Army Norway shifted its main efforts further south, the front in this sector reached a stalemate. Further south, the Finnish 3 Corps launched a new offensive towards the Murmansk Railway on 30 October, bolstered by reinforcements from Army Norway. Despite strong Soviet resistance, the Finnish forces managed to advance within 30 kilometers, 19 miles, of the railway. However, on 17 November, the Finnish High Command ordered a halt to all offensive operations in this sector due to diplomatic pressure from the United States, which sought to keep Allied aid shipments to the Soviet Union undisrupted. With the Finnish refusal to continue offensive operations and the Germans unable to proceed alone, the German-Finnish effort in central and northern Finland came to an end. Battle of Moscow. After Kiev, the Red Army no longer outnumbered the Germans, and there were no more trained reserves directly available. To defend Moscow, Stalin could field 800,000 men in 83 divisions, but only 25 divisions were fully effective. Operation Typhoon, the drive to Moscow, began on September 30, 1941. In front of Army Group Center was a series of elaborate defense lines, the first centered on Vyazma and the second on Mazhaisk. Russian peasants began fleeing ahead of the advancing German units, burning their harvested crops, driving their cattle away, and destroying buildings in their villages as part of a scorched earth policy to deny the Nazi war machine needed supplies and foodstuffs. The first blow took the Soviets completely by surprise when the 2nd Panzer Group, returning from the south, took Uryul, just 75 miles south of the Soviet 1st main defense line. 3 days later, the panzers pushed on to Bryansk, while the 2nd Army attacked from the west. The Soviet 3rd and 13th Armies were now encircled. To the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies attacked Vyazma, trapping the 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd Armies. Moscow's first line of defense had been shattered. The pocket eventually yielded over 500,000 Soviet prisoners, bringing the tally since the start of the invasion to 3 million. The Soviets now had only 90,000 men and 150 tanks left for the defense of Moscow. The German government publicly predicted the imminent capture of Moscow and convinced foreign correspondents of an impending Soviet collapse. On 13 October, the 3rd Panzer Group penetrated to within 87 miles of the capital. Martial law was declared in Moscow. Almost from the beginning of Operation Typhoon, however, the weather worsened. Temperatures fell, and continued rainfall turned the unpaved road network into mud, slowing the German advance on Moscow. Additional snowfalls followed by more rain created a glutinous mud that German tanks had difficulty traversing, while the Soviet T-34, with its wider tread, was better suited to navigate. At the same time, the supply situation for the Germans rapidly deteriorated. On 31 October, the German Army High Command ordered a halt to Operation Typhoon while the armies were reorganized. The pause gave the Soviets, far better supplied, time to consolidate their positions and organize formations of newly activated reservists. In little over a month, the Soviets organized 11 new armies, including 30 divisions of Siberian troops, freed from the Soviet Far East after Soviet intelligence assured Stalin there was no longer a threat from the Japanese. During October and November 1941, over 1,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft arrived along with the Siberian forces to assist in defending the city. With the ground hardening due to the cold weather, the Germans resumed the attack on Moscow on 15 November. Although the troops themselves could now advance again, there had been no improvement in the supply situation. Only 135,000 of the 600,000 trucks that had been available on June 22, 1941 were available by November 15, 1941. Ammunition and fuel supplies were prioritized over food and winter clothing, so many German troops looted supplies from local populations but could not fill their needs. Facing the Germans were the 5th, 16th, 30th, 43rd, 49th, and 50th Soviet armies. The Germans intended to move the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies across the Moscow Canal and envelop Moscow from the northeast. The 2nd Panzer Group would attack Tula and then close on Moscow from the south. As the Soviets reacted to their flanks, the 4th Army would attack the center. In 2 weeks of fighting, lacking sufficient fuel and ammunition, the Germans slowly crept towards Moscow. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Group was blocked. On 22 November, Soviet Siberian units, augmented by the 49th and 50th Soviet armies, attacked the 2nd Panzer Group and inflicted a defeat on the Germans. The 4th Panzer Group pushed the Soviet 16th Army back and succeeded in crossing the Moscow Canal in an attempt to encircle Moscow. On 2 December, part of the 258th Infantry Division advanced to within 15 miles of Moscow. They were so close that German officers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin, but by then the first blizzards had begun. A reconnaissance battalion managed to reach the town of Khimki, only about 5 miles from the Soviet capital. It captured the bridge over the Moscow-Volga Canal as well as the railway station, marking the easternmost advance of German forces. Despite the progress made, the Wehrmacht was not equipped for severe winter warfare. The Soviet army was better adapted to fighting in winter conditions but faced production shortages of winter clothing. The German forces fared worse, with deep snow further hindering equipment and mobility. Weather conditions had largely grounded the Luftwaffe, preventing large-scale air operations. Newly created Soviet units near Moscow now numbered over 500,000 men. Despite their inexperience, they were able to halt the German offensive by 5 December due to superior defensive fortifications, the presence of skilled and experienced leadership like Zhukov, and the poor German situation. On 5 December, the Soviet defenders launched a massive counterattack as part of the Soviet winter counteroffensive. The offensive halted on January 7, 1942, after pushing the German armies back 100 to 250 kilometers, 62 to 155 miles, from Moscow. The Wehrmacht had lost the battle for Moscow, and the invasion had cost the German army over 830,000 men. Aftermath. With the failure of the Battle of Moscow, all German plans for a quick defeat of the Soviet Union had to be revised. The Soviet counteroffensives in December 1941 inflicted heavy casualties on both sides but ultimately eliminated the German threat to Moscow. In an attempt to explain the failure, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 39, blaming the early onset of winter and severe cold as the primary reasons for the failed campaign. However, the main reasons included German military unpreparedness, poor intelligence on Soviet strength, extensive logistical difficulties, high attrition, and the overextension of German forces within the vast Soviet territories. On June 22, 1941, the German army had 209 divisions at its disposal, 163 of which were offensively capable. By March 31, 1942, less than a year after the invasion, the army was reduced to fielding 58 offensively capable divisions. The Red Army's resilience and effective counterattacks surprised the Germans as much as their initial attack had surprised the Soviets. Spurred on by the successful defense and in an effort to emulate the Germans, Stalin wanted to begin his own counteroffensive, not just against the German forces around Moscow, but against their armies in the north and south. Anger over the failed German offensives led Hitler to relieve Brauchitsch of command, and Hitler assumed personal control of the German army on December 19, 1941. This decision would progressively prove fatal to Germany's war effort and contribute to its eventual defeat. The Soviet Union had suffered heavily from the conflict, losing vast tracts of territory and enduring massive losses in men and materiel. Despite these setbacks, the Red Army demonstrated its capability to counter the German offensives, especially as the Germans began experiencing irreplaceable shortages in manpower, armaments, provisions, and fuel. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, dramatically altered the course of World War II. What began as a meticulously planned offensive by Nazi Germany ended in a prolonged, grueling conflict that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Third Reich. The immense scale of the invasion, the catastrophic losses on both sides, and the resilience of the Soviet Union have left an indelible mark on world history. The initial successes of the German Wehrmacht, driven by blitzkrieg tactics and overwhelming force, quickly ran into the harsh realities of the Soviet Union's vastness, harsh winters, and the tenacity of its defenders. Despite suffering staggering losses, the Soviet Red Army's ability to regroup, counterattack, and eventually turn the tide against the invaders demonstrated the resilience and resourcefulness that would characterize their war effort. The failure of Operation Barbarossa shattered Hitler's dreams of a swift victory over the Soviet Union and forced Germany into a protracted two-front war it could not sustain. The Battle of Moscow, in particular, marked a turning point, where the Wehrmacht, ill-prepared for the brutal Russian winter and overstretched in their supply lines, faced a resilient and determined Soviet defense. In the aftermath, the strategic errors, logistical failures, and underestimation of Soviet capabilities by the German High Command became glaringly evident. The resilience of the Soviet Union, coupled with the eventual entry of the United States into the war, ensured that the Axis powers would face an insurmountable challenge. As we reflect on Operation Barbarossa, it serves as a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences of war, the perils of underestimating one's opponent, and the profound impact of strategic decisions on the course of history. The bravery and sacrifices of millions who fought and perished in this conflict underscore the enduring human cost of war and the relentless pursuit of peace that followed. Thank you for listening to this detailed account of Operation Barbarossa. May the lessons of the past guide us towards a more peaceful and understanding future.